Okay, so we're going to discuss about the RBC metabolic pathways. So these different metabolic pathways is being utilized by our mature RBC in order for that to obtain the necessary products like energy in order for that to survive up to 120 days. So remember here that your mature RBC do not have already the nucleus or even the mitochondria, which is the site of your some metabolic pathways. So therefore, your RBC try to rely on other pathways in order for that to get the energy by the breakdown of your carbohydrates in order for that to obtain the necessary energy from that in order for that to survive. Okay, the first one, we have here your Embden-Meyerhof pathway or simply your anaerobic glycolysis. So glycolysis is a process whereby your glucose is being broken down to convert that one to your pyruvic acid. Along the process of the conversion or the breakdown of your glucose to produce here the pyruvic acid, you are generating ATP. The main product produced here with your glycolysis would be the 2-ATP. ATP is needed here by our RBC for the following. Number one, for the intracellular cationic gradient maintenance, for maintenance of the phospholipid distribution, for the glutathione synthesis. Okay, so basically the ATP is needed here in order for the RBC to maintain its biconcave, this shape. Okay, the decrease in the ATP production, or you call this one as your decreased phosphorylation process, that may result here to the changes in the biconcave shape of the RBC. That would result here to your sphering process. And sphere is not the normal RBC morphology. And once the RBC would have a different morphology than the usual na biconcave disc, it would result here to the um, an early destruction of your RBC, especially if that one is being carried to our spleen. If your blood is being carried to our spleen, ang spleen ang papatay sa RBC na may mga abnormal morphology. That's a normal process of your red blood cell destruction. And therefore, for the RBC, para marating niyang 120 days, dapat maintain niya lahat ng kaniyang morphology. And that's being provided here by the ATP, so that would maintain the ATP is needed here to maintain the biconcave this shape of the RBC. Second one, your ATP is also needed here for metabolic pumps. Example for that, we have your sodium potassium ATPase pump. So sodium potassium ATPase pump, this is a pump here that try to regulate the in and out of your intracellular potassium and your extracellular sodium. Mean to say, this would allows for the maintenance of high level of your potassium na nasa loob ng membrane natin, ng RBC natin, at mababa dapat na concentration outside of your RBC membrane for the sodium because your potassium is intracellular and your sodium is an extracellular dapat. And in order for that, na para ma-move niya ang sodium potassium in and out the cell here to maintain that balance. So, it's needed here your pump in the form of your sodium potassium ATPase. So, from the word itself, ATPase, so kailangan niya ng ATP para ma-move niya ang sodium natin in and out of your cell. And that is being provided by the ATP produced here through your glycolysis or your Embden-Meyerhof pathway. Okay, the next metabolic pathway, we have here your Hexose monophosphate shunt pathway or your pentose phosphate pathway or your phosphogluconate pathway. So this pathway is needed here to convert your glucose 6-phosphate into your byproducts NADPH. Another one na product dito sa ating Hexose monophosphate shunt pathway would be your ribose 5-phosphate. But then your ribose 5-phosphate is being utilized primarily for your nucleotide synthesis, for your DNA synthesis. Pero ang ginagamit talaga ni RBC natin with this metabolic pathway ay ang NADPH. Okay, so this metabolic pathway require the enzyme na glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. Okay, so NADPH is needed by the RBC for its reductive biosynthesis. Pag sinabing reductive biosynthesis here, ito magiging source ng energy natin para ma-recycle natin ang ating glutathione. So, we have here the oxidized na glutathione versus your reduced na glutathione. Your glutathione in your body serve as our antioxidant that would protect our red blood cell here against your oxidizing agent. So, pag may nakita na oxidizing agent ng ating RBC, that will be protected here by your glutathione. So, however, here, once the glutathione try to exert already its antioxidant property, hindi na siya magiging functional. Hindi unlimited ang function ng ating glutathione. Pag nag-exert na siya ng kanyang antioxidant property, it will assume here the state of your oxidized na glutathione. So, para ulit maging functional siya, para maka-act ulit siya as antioxidant to exert its antioxidant property, so, i-renew ang ating glutathione here. Bibigyan natin siya ng energy in order for that to become functional again. So, to convert your oxidized glutathione to become your reduced na glutathione, which is the functional na state, then kailangan mo ng NADPH. And this NADPH is the product of your Hexose monophosphate shunt pathway. Okay, so in a case here wherein for example, the patient do not have here the glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase, so may metabolic condition ang patient natin na glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. Glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency is inherited disorder. Very common siya among female population. So, glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, pag wala ka nitong enzyme na to, glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase, wala ka rin maproproduce na NADPH. And therefore, once you've been exposed here with an oxidizing agent, walang protection ng ating RBC. Pag walang protection ng RBC natin, your hemoglobin, specifically the globin component of your hemoglobin, remember that your hemoglobin is made up of your heme and the globin, diba? So the globin portion of your hemoglobin will be precipitated. Pag na-precipitate siya, it will form here your Heinz bodies. Heinz bodies, so dito siya, usually found here on your periphery. Dito siya sa edge ng RBC natin. Okay, once your blood, for example, is being delivered to your spleen, papuntang blood na sa spleen, and your blood contains RBC na may mga Heinz bodies dito na inclusion bodies. So we'll discuss later on what are other inclusion bodies, and Heinz bodies is one of the inclusion bodies. So this is the RBC na may precipitated na globin dito. So once this one will be delivered to your spleen, makikita nito na spleen ay kakaiba itong RBC morphology na ito. Bakit parang may something siya sa loob? Ang gagawin ni spleen, tatanggalin niya itong Heinz bodies natin. So, kakainin niya to, okay, by the process called here the pitting. Okay, pitting is a process whereby your spleen try to remove the inclusion bodies within our RBC. So, ito siya, pag tinanggal ito ni spleen natin, ang Heinz bodies natin, what you have here would be this one. You call this one as your bite cell or your helmet na cell. Okay, so now, pag maging bite cell or helmet cell na, pag nakita ulit siya ni spleen, ay bakit kakaiba ang nito, ang shape nito, abnormal RBC ito. Now, the spleen will going to destroy those RBC having the abnormal morphology, including your bite cell or your helmet cell, and try to destroy that one in the process called here the culling. So once it's being destroyed here, the RBC, having abnormal morphology, including your bite cell or your helmet cell, will result here to hemolytic reactions. And therefore, mag-rupture ito, and therefore the patient would have here experienced hemolytic reactions. And very common sa mga glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency patient ang hemolytic reactions. Once they are exposed to your oxidizing agent, it's because here they don't have the protection of their RBC because they don't have here an antioxidant property of the glutathione kasi hindi na re-regenerate ang kanyang glutathione kasi wala siyang NADPH. This is because na wala siyang enzyme na glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. So, although naman, glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency na patient, not all the time, they will experience hemolytic reactions. Nagkakaroon lang sila ng hemolytic reactions once they are exposed to oxidizing agents. Oxidizing agents like mga drugs, medications, mga food. So, pag alam mo ang bata or pasyente na may glucose phosphate dehydrogenase siya, may mga pagkain, may mga gamot lang na bawal sa kanya. So, ang ginagawa ay iwasan niya lang and then hindi siya magkakaroon ng hemolytic reaction or RBC ruptures. Pero pag hindi niya alam, then accidentally nakain niya or nabigyan siya ng gamot na oxidizing, then eventually magiging ganito ang kanyang pathways. Okay, that's your Hexose monophosphate shunt pathway, which provides you with the NADPH. Okay, the next metabolic pathway, we have your methemoglobin reductase pathway. So, other name for your methemoglobin reductase na enzyme, that's your cytochrome B5 reductase. So, this pathway would maintain the hemoglobin, the iron, your hemoglobin in the ferrous state or the F2+. Okay, the ferrous state is the functional state of your iron in your hemoglobin. So, once your hemoglobin, the iron on that is in the functional state na ferrous, it able to bind with your oxygen and eventually able to deliver your oxygen. However, for example, if the iron in your hemoglobin is in the ferric, your Fe3+, the ferric na state, that is not a functional state, then hemoglobin could not bind with your oxygen and therefore hindi siya makapag-deliver ng oxygen natin. So, ginagawa ng pathway na to, it would maintain your iron in your hemoglobin in the functional state na ferrous. So, again, if this was your hemoglobin, so made up of the heme component and the globin component. Ang heme natin made up of the protoporphyrin ring. So, parang itong ring natin. And sa gitna niya, we have here the iron in your ferrous. In your ferrous state, this is the functional state that would allow your hemoglobin to bind with your oxygen and eventually able to transport, to deliver your oxygen. Pag nasa ferric ito, anong ferric natin? That's your Fe3+. This is non-functional. Okay, so pag ganitong iron mo in your hemoglobin, the ferric state, it could not bind with oxygen and therefore could not deliver. So we have your deficiency of your methemoglobin reductase enzyme may be related to the following condition. Number one, wala kang methemoglobin reductase. Okay, because eventually, anyway, ang tawag doon sa hemoglobin natin na ang iron niya is in the ferric state, that's your methemoglobin. Pag methemoglobin, that's your iron in the ferric state. However, this one, methemoglobin reductase, that would reduce your hemoglobin with the iron from the ferric to the ferrous state. And therefore, maintaining that one in your ferrous state, which is the functional state. Okay, we have your condition leading to your methemoglobin production. So, bakit nagkakaroon ng methemoglobin? So, number one, acquired because due to exposure to your chemicals like your, or even drugs like your nitrate, nitrite, and chloroquine. That would eventually result here to the production of your methemoglobin where the iron is in the ferric na state. Second one, wala kang enzyme na methemoglobin reductase. And therefore, could not reduce here your ferric to the ferrous. This one is inherited disorder, congenital defects of the enzyme. Third one, because of the mutation in your alpha, beta, and gamma globin, that's result here of your hemoglobin, and that's result here to the production of your hemoglobin M or hemoglobin M. Hemoglobin M is one of your hemoglobinopathies. This is abnormal na hemoglobin. Okay, so this one, so all of us three here result to the production of your methemoglobin. And the methemoglobin would have here the iron of that is in the ferric state. And they are non-functional na mga hemoglobin. Hindi sila makapag-bind sa ating oxygen and eventually could not transport also the oxygen. Ano mangyayari pag hindi sila makapag-transport ng oxygen? Hindi masusuplayan ng oxygen ng mga tissues natin. And therefore, you have your tissue hypoxia. However, in number 1 and number 2 na condition are reversible. Reversible, you can reverse this one from the methemoglobin, from the ferric to ferrous, pwede mo siya ma-reverse para maging functional siya by administration of your methylene blue. Pero yung hemoglobin M natin na hemoglobinopathy, which is a type of mutation in your hemoglobin, this is irreversible. This one will not be responsive for the treatment with your methylene blue. Okay, the next pathway, we have here your Rapoport-Luebering pathway. So this pathway provides you with the 2,3-DPG or your diphosphoglycerate. Other name for that is your 2,3-bi or bis, okay, bis-phosphoglycerate. So 2,3-DPG is needed here or it try to affect our ODC. ODC stand for your oxygenation curve, which try to describe here the affinity of our hemoglobin with our oxygen. So, Rapoport pathway is the one responsible here for the production of your 2,3-DPG. Okay, now we go to your ODC, or again, ODC stand here for oxygenation curve. So, oxygenation curve here just represent the relationship between your percent saturation of your hemoglobin with your oxygen. So, dito ay pressure, partial pressure ng oxygen. Ito ang percentage ng saturation ng ating hemoglobin. Okay, the normal shape of our ODC is sigmoid pa S na shape. We have the term partial pressure 50. So, partial pressure 50 here represent that your hemoglobin, so this is the percentage, 50% saturated with your hemoglobin. Okay, your oxygen is 50% saturated with your hemoglobin. So, kung itong 50%, so hanapin mo dito, kung itong normal, hindi lang maganda ang drawing ko dito. So, pag hinanap mo dito, ang 50% nito ay makikita sa dito na part. Okay, that's 26.6 mmHg. On the other hand, arterial blood is 95% saturated with oxygen. So, kung 95%, dito hanapin mo 95, tapos hanapin mo dito, kung siya sa dito mag-fall na, kung saan tatama siya sa graph natin, then ito ang kanyang partial pressure. So, ganun din, 95% saturated with oxygen is 95 mmHg. That's in the case of your arterial blood. For the venous blood, it's 70% saturated with oxygen, and that's could be found here at 40 mmHg. So, ulit, parang ganito lang. Kung 50% siya, so itong 50%, ang part na ito is percentage, this is the partial pressure ng oxygen in mm of your mercury. That's the unit of your partial pressure. So, kung 50%, katulad nito, 50%, so dito siya tatama. So, ano mo lang dito ng line, you draw a line na straight. Okay, so, ito magiging partial pressure natin. Like, kung P50 ito, so that's at 26. So, dito siya ma-fall, that's 26.6 mmHg. You try ito, 95%. Hanapin mo dito. Okay, so always at 95% din siya. 95 mmHg. Or 70%, hanapin mo siya, tapos ganun mo siya, that's 40 mmHg. Again, hindi lang maganda ang pagka-draw ng ating graph. So, you still have the picture naman sa PowerPoint, so try to check for that. Okay, then we have here, another hand, there are some condition here that try to move your oxygenation curve to your left and to your right. Pag sinabi kong to the left, that's your own na left na hand, okay na position, okay, or right nyo, sa right ko, right nyo din dyan. So, your oxygenation curve would eventually shift here to the left. Pag sinabing mag-shift the left, kung ito normal, so dito siya. So, pwede ang curve natin, pwede siya dito. That's shift to your left. Kung dito siya, papunta dito sa right nyo, you call that one as your shift to your right. Kailan nag-shift ang ating oxygenation curve to your left? Left of your standard na graph. Okay, so shift to your left would eventually occur here in the following condition. Pag mataas ang pH, okay, this is your alkalosis. Pag mababa ang other factors like carbon dioxide, mababang temperature, and mababang level ng 2,3-DPG. Shift to the left would eventually characterized by Anong ginagawa ng hemoglobin pag nag-shift to the left tayo? Dalawa lang naman ang activity ng hemoglobin. Number one, pwede siya mag-bind sa ating oxygen, or another na activity niya, i-deliver niya ang oxygen sa tissues natin. Pag shift to the left, ang ginagawa ni hemoglobin natin, i-try to bind with your oxygen. Okay, that's why shift to your left is characterized by increased affinity or binding of your hemoglobin with your oxygen. Since nag-bind siya, hindi siya gagawa, it will not deliver muna. Kaya decrease ang delivery natin. And that would be shift to the left if mataas ang pH natin, mababang carbon dioxide, mababang temperature, saka mababa ang 2,3-DPG. Other condition that eventually will shift here your oxygenation curve to your left. Okay, in the case of your alkalosis, kaya mataas ang pH. Transfusion of your 2,3 depleted na blood. Pag nag-donate tayo ng blood, ang blood, bago siya isalin sa patient natin, di ba, sinistore mo na siya sa blood bank natin. Sa ref natin sa blood bank. Every day, bumababa ang level ng 2,3-DPG natin pag in-store natin sa blood bank ref ang blood natin. So, if you're transfusing the blood, so with the 2,3 depleted na blood, uminto sa blood na medyo matagal na siya, pero hindi pa siya expired Medyo tumagal na siya pagka-extract sa pag-store sa kanya, it would eventually have a decreased 2,3-DPG, and therefore ito siya, it will shift your oxygenation curve to your left. Or maybe you have here an increased level of your abnormal hemoglobin, like for example, your hemoglobin F, would also shift here your oxygenation curve to your left. Now we have here your shift to your right with your oxygenation curve. It's just the opposite lang nito. Okay, shift to the right would eventually, okay, characterized by increased delivery. So ito na, nagde-deliver na siya. Since nag-deliver siya, okay, mababa ang kanya. Hindi siya nagbabind kasi nakapag-bind na siya kanina. Increased delivery, decreased affinity or binding. Shift to the right would be characterized by opposite ulit. Ito, kanina mababa, so sila ulit ang mataas ngayon. Carbon dioxide, to 3 pg, temperature, at mababa ang pH mo dito. That's acidosis. Okay, so kailan nag-perform ang hemoglobin natin ng shift to the right? Again, pag meaning to say nagde-deliver siya ng oxygen sa tissues natin. Ginagawa niya yan pag anemic ang patient natin at kailangan ng mga tissues natin ng oxygen. Try to deliver your hemoglobin, try to deliver oxygen in the case of your anemia as a response to your anemia. Because your tissues in your body are needing oxygen. That's why you try to deliver, and that will shift here your oxygenation curve to your right. Okay, we have here the term Bohr effect. It's just, this one try to describe only the relationship of your pH and carbon and oxygen affinity. Haldane effect, on the other hand, would describe the relationship between carbon dioxide and the oxygen affinity. Okay, so these are all about our RBC metabolic pathways.